All right. Good morning. How are
Good
you?
morning. I am well. I'm well. Good morning.
Good morning. We're starting this again, but I wanted to say thank you so much for taking time to talk with myself and Textile Society of America. I wanted to just kind of jump in because I know that this is a busy time for you. And would you mind sharing a little bit about what the next couple of weeks will look like for you as we start? Yeah, exactly.
Wow. Well, the next couple weeks, in fact, I was working on my baby doll dress right before you called. I'm working on finishing that up. So, there's a lot of appearances and events but especially the costume making. So lots of sewing going on.
So I think I should back the conversation up a little bit and ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do, and we'll get to the costume making. And I also want to use language that is correct because we're going to be talking about costumes and suits in this conversation.
Yes. Yes.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
Of course. But yeah, would you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing, and we can get into the costumes and suits.
Yes, well, I'm a native New Orleanian, and I grew up in the heart of Treme. My family owned a restaurant there for about 50 years, and I attended St. Louis Cathedral Academy and, all those things Creole, like we love to eat gumbo, and we were a Catholic family, and my family's been here for a few centuries. So, and that's a whole other that's a whole other conversation.
Mhm.
But basically, I became a historic interpreter in the 1990s, tour guide, and I'm also a nurse in my other life. So that's it in a nutshell. So I'm a cultural activist, probably for the most part, I could say at this point.
I know it's a pretty big nutshell, though. There's a lot going on in there. And so what first brought you into this need to first educate and then also expand that and become a creative as well as part of that?
I think growing up in the French Quarter is just phenomenal. I always thank my parents for that opportunity. They didn't plan it like that, but to grow up around so many diverse people, New Orleans is still a port city. So there were a lot of people from around the world in my class. And then I knew some of my own family history, which is pretty deep. And history just has always interested me all through school. So, that sparked the interest for me to later become a tour guide. I'm like, I want to talk about this. I want to educate people about it. And then as I was nursing, I did do tour guiding, but then it intensified, of course, after Katrina, when I felt like everything was being lost, and it has changed a lot in the past 18 years since then. So I have basically accelerated my efforts, to help to preserve my Creole culture.
I'm so interested in what Katrina did, of course, in terms of changing the demographics as well of New Orleans. But also, there's a conversation around what COVID did as well and how it
Yeah.
affected Mardi Gras and community in that space. So I was curious your thoughts about where we stand now and what it's looking, or has it changed at all now that we are maybe out of COVID or feeling at least able to mingle?
I feel like it has changed yet again, and I feel like COVID placed even more economic restraints on our people in the neighborhoods. You had rents that rose during that time period of COVID, despite, all the health issues. Then, of course, you get people that were passing away, people that are sick and have, post-COVID issues and things like that. So I feel like COVID in no way helped the situation. In fact, I would definitively say it hurt the culture even further. Our neighborhoods emptied out even more. You could ride through the neighborhoods and you would see people's stuff on the sidewalks that had been evicted and such. So, you know, and then we didn't have the ability to work. So suit making, you know, got really sketchy at one point because, you know, if you can't work, you can't buy beads and such. So it did affect us a lot, and it affected the culture.
And when we talk about the culture, it's many, many, many things all at once. We're not just talking about suits. We're not just talking about costumes. Can you tell us a little bit more when we're talking about this kind of idea of the culture? What is it that we're really talking about?
We are talking about the entire lifestyle. We're talking about the food, ways, you know, religious aspects of the culture. We're talking about, you know, our educators, our, you know, and then of course the people that mask, the things that we see, you know, that people are actively involved in during things like Mardi Gras season. And now we're like all over festivals and everything else. So we're talking about just and I'm glad you asked that question because a lot of people see us masking, you know, as Indians or baby dolls or whatever have you, and they forget our culture is actually a living thing. This is what we live every day, you know. So just the whole aspect of us living, again, from foodways to religion and everything else, you can see it all changing, you know, because the community has changed a lot.
Mm-hmm. I'm I'm glad that you mentioned that it's an everyday lived experience because even the suit making is almost a 365 kind of task. It seems incredibly ornate and visually they're spectacles. But can you tell me about the making process and what it entails as well?
So to start off with, there are a couple different beading styles. So the original style was basically flat bead work, you know, and of course, over the years, we've evolved in terms of what we use. So they may have used like bottle caps and fish scales and old brooches and things like that. Well, that evolved, of course, to beads and different types of feathers. Initially, you know, the more advanced, you know, later in our history, they would make flat suits. And
Mm-hmm.
then Tootie Montana changed that and he started adding three-dimensional pieces, you know, a lot of them abstract. They look like pieces that would come off of a building because that was his trade and he brought that. And then you have, of course, different areas of the city. You have like Baccatown Indians, you have the Ninth Ward Indians. For the most part, most of them are going to be flat. It's going to be Treme, Seventh Ward, and some of the back of town Indians that you're going to see, you know, the traditional sort of 3D pieces. It is a 365, if not more, undertaking, you know, especially with these 3D pieces, because not only do you have to design it, but you have to create a pattern. And then you have to figure out how many pieces of the pattern you need. And I mean, it can be hundreds of pieces. You know, you look at the suit and you think, oh, it's beautiful. But then you don't realize when you start counting the numbers of pieces that need to go together to create one whole piece, you know, and then you realize you have to create 10 of those intricate pieces. You're already looking at hundreds. And then they each have to be beaded and then put together. So I always say it's about maybe a 5 to step um, process as opposed to making a flat piece of beaded art, which is beautiful in itself. I mean, there's some of the most beautiful beaded works that you'll ever want to see on the streets, whether they're flat or 3D. It's just that the 3D pieces take a lot longer because of the assembly and things like that.
And what's being produced now, or are there trends in making, such as like now it's moving either to kind of a flat more than anything, or are the styles evolving so there are trends that are different now than they were maybe 10 years ago?
They're not changing excessively. You see people creating like huge crowns. And then you have people like my chief is actually scaling that back to where the crown is not as massive because you get to a point where it looks like a float.
Mm,
So it's scaled back and the work is more intricate. So you get to more of a mastering of the craft. It's
mhm,
getting more complex, even though it's getting smaller. It's sort of like a diamond. You can have a huge diamond, but then you have a perfect tiny diamond. And so it's sort of, he's moving in that direction. But in terms of the style, you see different colors and things like that. And you do see some of the tribes maybe borrowing different feather types, from uptown to downtown or and so forth. But for the most part, it's kind of stayed the same. The only thing is that you have, I think, less and less people doing the actual 3D work.
mm.
It's not the same as it used to be. But then, it's harder to get, we have young people in the tradition, but it's harder to get them to, kind of follow through and do it every year. And, the world's changing. We have cell phones now. We have distractions. We have so many things to get involved in besides, masking.
Can you tell us a little bit about your own entry into this tradition?
So
As
my
the
entry into the Black masking Indian tradition was just a few years ago, and I was a queen. And then our big queen sort of defected, and so I became big queen. But at any rate, I got my start. It was kind of right before COVID. We did some pieces for a baby doll outfit that I did. But then I created a white suit because it was my first year. And, I had to order stuff because we had no access with COVID. So I'm ordering stuff from like Ukraine and China and all over the world. And basically I sewed, for the whole year. Exactly what he called for. And I did a whole 3D suit and I finally came out and it's like nothing else, and I felt the same way in the baby doll dress. I think because it's so deeply rooted in the heart of who we are, these sacred traditions that I was kind of speechless. It took a while for it to sink in that, okay, I'm a queen now. And not the idea that I'm a queen, but just the idea that I am carrying on this tradition, which I think actively being involved is one of the best ways to preserve this. Because I could write about it, I could talk about it, we could all do all these things, but if nobody's doing it, then the possibility of it dying is very real.
Yeah, it's an embodied practice. You are in it and you
Yes.
feel it, and there's no
Yeah.
way to describe it
I love
except
that you
through
describe it
touch.
that way. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a whole body experience. And I would love if you shared a little bit about the background of the Black Indian masking and where that came from. And I know it's a long and storied, and I also, as someone who has experienced Indian masking in the Caribbean, I also know
Mhm.
that there's certain also misunderstandings of it as well.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so if you would give a little bit of context to that as well, that would be helpful, I think.
Yes. So, before Louisiana was founded, there were thousands of indigenous people here already who wore feathers and beadwork and such. And then you had enslaved Africans that were brought in. And while some of them were, I'm sorry, enslaved alongside each other, the indigenous and enslaved Africans, and then of course the Creole, Afro-Creole people that were here. Um, we can't say it's because enslaved people ran away and they found friendship in the swamps with indigenous people. So therefore we pay homage to them, starting in the 1880s or whatever have you. That's the theory that a lot of people will go by, but for a couple different reasons, I'm kind of on the fence about that. So there were newspaper accounts of people, they say, running around in feathers throughout the year, but also on Mardi Gras Day, and some of them were in small groups, but a lot of people would just kind of be by themselves. What were they doing? We don't know. Were they necessarily indigenous people or Afro-Creole people or mixed? We don't know. We know that the first named tribe that we know of was in the 1880s. They were called the Creole Wild West. The term Creole popping up in that instance is fascinating to me, because that tells you probably what they identified as. And not a lot of people talk about that. You know, that word Creole. There was also the Wild Bill's show that came through town, and the people with him, the indigenous people, indigenous looking people that came with him, dressed like Plains Indians. Now, people will dispute that claim, you know, that we copied the Plains Indians, but when you look at the dress of some of the first Indians that we have pictures of, and you look at the fact that they call themselves the Creole Wild West, you know, for a few other reasons, it makes you give a little bit of weight to that. But we are not 100% sure where this tradition started or why. You can find little bits of indigenous people and some African sacred practices as well. You know, it was highly secretive in the beginning, and we would go out and fight. So if you had a beef with someone, you know, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, you would go out. You know, a lot of these people, let's just say some of them did not make it home. And my own grandfather told me of Indians walking around with bloody machetes on Mardi Gras Day. So the other idea is, if you're paying homage to indigenous people, why are you out killing each other? Anyway, it's kind of complicated, but I don't really have a specific theory yet, because I'm just constantly, you know, trying to research and talk to people and figure it out. We don't know. I don't know that we'll ever know, but I know that, you know, over time the tradition changed, and now we say we fight with the needle and thread to see who can be the prettiest. But, you know, in my estimation, everybody's pretty because they sat down and they worked with that needle and thread, and they followed that time-honored tradition. They paid homage to their ancestors and followed this beautiful sacred tradition wherever it started.
Yeah. No, I love that. And also this idea that we may not know is also giving us a reminder that there's so much of a archive that's missing, right? For very many reasons, purposefully and right, just through time. But there's something
Yeah.
about cloth, and especially clothing and masquerading, that when preserved, it is a different kind of history. It's a different kind of archive. And
Yes,
so it's not substituting what's not there, but it's at least preserving something that will never, you know, again, in terms of written text, we just won't know in that particular way. But in a material way, we still have a connection, you know?
definitely,
And,
definitely. I
and, and
agree.
yeah, and I'd love to talk about baby dolls too, because that's an
Yes,
incredible story tradition that you
yes.
have a hand in that I'd love to hear more about too.
Yeah, so baby dolling, actually, this is my 10th anniversary into baby dolling. And you know, they've been around, we believe, again, this is another one where we don't have the exact origins, but we do know that vaudeville was very popular here. And, you know, if you listen to some of the songs, they talk about being as pretty as a baby doll and so forth. So we believe that the first baby dolls came out of an area called Black Storyville. That's where Louis Armstrong was raised in his younger years before he left New Orleans. And, you know, there were ladies of the night that supposedly started the tradition, and they wore these little bitty short skirts. It was born out of partially out of the idea that we couldn't go and be in parade. You know, all of this, all of the Black masking culture. There was no place for us in the big uptown parades. All we could do was light the way, you know, with the torches and things like that. So you know, you're talking about Jim Crow New Orleans, where everything was highly restrictive. We didn't necessarily have work opportunities, couldn't go parade, but we wanted to express ourselves, right? We needed that outlet of expression. So these women got together, they formed a group, they collected dues, they went on these little bitty short skirts, they had garters with money in them, they supposedly threw money at men. They had sticks to fight off men, on the other hand. You know, they smoked cigars. So that was my signature, you know, when we first started coming back out, because there's been a couple different resurgences, and I was probably part of maybe the third resurgence. So when I became a doll, I'm going to guesstimate maybe 4 or so active groups were out there. And now we're up to like 14 or 16 active groups. So my signature was a cigar, and I was the first group to really, uh, recognize the Storyville, meaning that my group is called the Black Storyville Babydolls. So, you know, we represent that area. So.
And what kind of dress do they wear, if you describe it, for someone who may have never seen a baby doll?
So short satin dresses
Mhm.
with usually a bonnet. Sometimes we wear hats. Like I got really into all sorts of hat creations because I'm totally in love with actually the Storyville era from the late 1800s till like 1920. So I would create these big hats with feathers and such. But traditionally, you know, we would wear bonnets. You may have on gloves and shoes with bobby socks, little baby socks, maybe with some lace. The skirt is typically short. Most of the time, you would have satin and then some sort of bloomer, of course, underneath. And now we carry a lot of umbrellas. Sometimes I'll still do a stick, but you'll have umbrellas. I do a cigar. Some people use baby bottles, not filled with milk, but you
A
know,
little
so that's
libation for the road.
yeah. So that's kind of typical of what you'll see a baby doll
Mhm.
looking like.
Do men ever play baby dolls, or is it only women?
Oh, yes, men have played baby dolls historically going way back. You know, they
Mhm.
would either dress with diapers, maybe, or they would wear like satin outfits to match the ladies. You know, and today I'm trying to think if there are any active men right now that I can't think of any that are actively out there, but you
Mhm.
know, in fact, I had part of my group, an auxiliary group, the first trans person, um, you know, to be somewhat of a baby doll. So
Mhm.
yeah, it's completely open to anybody who wants to, you know, person of color who wants to be a baby doll.
Yeah. I asked because in Trinidad, which is my point of reference, baby dolls actually, and we also have baby dolls. It was an island that had a significant influence from the French, even though they weren't French for most of its colonial life. It had a
Hmm.
huge French presence. And we also had Code Noir, or people who had been affected and were familiar with Code Noir in Trinidad. So it was a
Hmm.
British colony. But it began with men making fun of women and being derisive towards women, and then women took over that baby doll tradition, and it
I love
also feels
that.
a resurgent as well, right? It also feels fresh, a generation of women who are reclaiming that space, which also sounds like
Hmm.
what Baby Dolls of Storyville, Storyville Baby Dolls is about as well. And can you talk about Storyville a little bit as well? Like what is or was Storyville?
Storyville was an area, so you know they thought New Orleans, the politicians thought New Orleans was just getting out of control with vice and prostitution and all this stuff. So they designated an area just behind the French Quarter where a prostitute could practice her trade. It wasn't necessarily legal, but it wasn't illegal as long as you did it in this area. Of course, it didn't work to control it. But anyway, they tried, and that area became known as Storyville. you had women of different colors. It was mostly Caucasian women, but of course you had octoroons. That was a big deal in Storyville because it was seen as being so attractive. And then of course you did have darker skinned prostitutes there, but then you had just across Canal Street, which is within a mile of Storyville proper, you had an area called or that we call Black Storyville. And that is where the very poor, typically darker skinned prostitutes were.
Mm.
So it was just it was a dividing, Canal Street was like a dividing line in
Yeah.
that. And that was the difference between downtown and uptown. So Black Storyville would have been uptown. They were very, very poor. They typically worked out of cribs and not the big, beautiful mansions that you would have seen in Storyville proper. So but it was a family-oriented neighborhood in terms of the types of people that lived there. They weren't all impoverished, but you had a lot of poverty in the area. The area could also get very rough, as Louis Armstrong tells a lot of stories about that, about how rough, you had a fight one night between Mary Jack the bear and Deborah, who was a prostitute. And, in fact, the founder of the original Babydolls in 1912, her name was Beatrice Hill. And she had to go and get syphilis treatments and all this stuff. It was very, it was very sad. It was remarkably sad, the lives that some people had to live. But out of that was born all of this beautiful creativity that we still try to carry on today.
Yeah. And speaking of, I'm curious about the research that you've actually had to undertake. For example, Beatrice's story, learning about the first baby doll, and also the Unheard Voices project as well, that kind of feeds
Yes.
into that. And again, because I think some of, even like in terms of architecture and the way we divide cities, it's not just about pushing some people off to be unseen, but also their stories become unheard, right? When we kind of
Yes.
subject them to the margins. And so a lot of your work is bringing those voices and those stories kind of back into the forefront. So I just want to talk about your research on the Unheard Voices project as well that you're working on.
Well, Unheard Voices. So all along since the night, since I started doing tour guiding and historic interpreting, the first thing I did was wrote a tour called My Color, My People, because there weren't any. There was only one other person that had started sometime in that time frame. And eventually she opened a museum. But it's always fascinated me. And I've always been like, why aren't they telling our stories? Like, why there's so much to unearth. And so, later on, I just expanded that. And in the 2011, I started Unheard Voices with a partner, Ronnie Schumann. And because we would go on tours, and we were actually working at a plantation at the time. I was working there part-time. And we were both like, why are they not telling the stories of the people that built these places? Why is this like a fun place to be? So we actually wrote Unheard Voices of Louisiana, and, just unearthed all of these stories, which takes a lot of time in archives and, reading different books. There's a lot more scholarship on it today, which is great you know, but I've had to dig through archives and just all sorts of avenues like genealogy records and different things. And we were kind of looking at the scope of people here, not just people of African descent, but also, Irish and Italian and different groups. So, it's taken a lot of work, but and the Babydolls falls into that, right? It falls into my history. And some of the research that I had done, my family's history is very deep in these areas. People don't know that. A lot of people think of me as like downtown Treme, because that's what we're usually talking about. But my mother was actually raised uptown, and she has connections to those places, some specifically, which I can't talk about yet. And some of them are very sad and gut-wrenching and all those things, which is some of the places that my research has led me to with different people, outside of my families, outside of my family. In fact, the last year I masked as a baby doll, the back of my suit had a beading patch. It was like an 8x10 of Mamie Daydune. She played the piano. She was great at playing the piano, singing the blues. And she was a strong influence of Jelly Roll Morton. He talks about her in his interviews, but you'd never hear anybody talk about her. So I said, you know what? I'm going to put her on the front page of my baby doll dress. And that's what I did. And people always ask me, who is that? What is, and I tell them her name and they're like, who is she? I'm like, she's only Jelly Roll Martin's biggest influence. So,
That's it. That's it.
that's it. That's all. So, just things like that. That's places like that. It almost feels like I'm actually walking through the neighborhoods, and I feel like, and I don't know if that's because of how I grew up, in a restaurant, like just getting to know, because everybody has a story, but we have a tendency to leave half of these people where they're at and go with, the most popular or the wealthiest or the this or that. Whereas the quiet person sitting there that seemingly has nothing and nothing to offer can quite often be the one that has the most to offer.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I always say the richest libraries in the world are our cemeteries, because we all have a story to tell. So,
Is there a dedication this year to anyone specific in any of your masking? Or can
um,
we not tell? Do you not tell until you reveal it?
well, I can tell you that the influence comes from my favorite time period. So let's say
Okay.
late 1800s.
Okay. All right.
So
We'll have to see it.
yes, I'm
We'll put-
excited. I'm really excited. So, especially with like the fabric that I've used, and because I think through all of those things, the fabric, the different beads, the lace. If I showed you, you'd pass out. I have like crates of lace that I'm going through just to get the right lace and the right, all the right textiles to work in this baby doll dress. So, and the bonnet or hat that I have to create for this to make it special. So,
Please, when you have your images, I'll follow you. I will find out what it ends up being. I cannot wait. Is there anything else that you're excited about coming up? Any other projects?
just, I have a film project in the works, and it speaks to the Black masking culture. I have, gosh, all kinds of stuff. Beading classes. It's going to be an intergenerational class where I put, our elders with young people, and they'll be working on projects. I also have something called Out of the Black Box coming up. And I mean, there's like a music project I'm helping to work on, and it's so many things, it just does not stop. So there's just not enough of me to do all the work. So
Well, I'm so glad that we got this part and this time with you. I know that you have so many things to do, but so grateful again for the time and the wisdom and the history that you shared. In awe of, and we spoke on this before, but the way that we are connected through masking culture, but also the
yeah,
way that those cultures are so different and so special and speak to the heart of people who are just so invested in making sure that the culture continues. So thank you for what you do.
definitely. Thank you. Thank you for doing this and, giving this to the world. And, without our voices being heard, it's a moot point, right? So thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to stop recording. There we go.